on the door and he goes, 9 out of 10 of those Irish, they like Doherty. This was his candidate. You know, I know I can get those folks. You got to go ethnically with this.
I know.
Okay, Kelly, you ready?
I'm going to ask you some Chicago questions at the end as well.
Okay, so Chair.
Okay, probably good speed.
We got speed? One of the reasons why I liked it when we were in graduate school, you told me to go do field research, is I loved going out and just sitting at luncheonettes and coffee stands and things, talking to people about politics. And it always amazed me, you know, early in the morning people would be talking about 3 things: sports, the weather, and politics.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it about politics? Why do we care about it? I mean, why do we talk about it? What does politics fulfill in people?
I think politics fulfills in people the sense that it is a game, a bit like sports, a bit like the stock market, in which if you have any interest in the subject, you want to see who's doing well and who's doing poorly. I think fewer Americans regard politics as a game today than once was the case. I think more Americans are turned off by politics and begin to see it as a game in the bad sense. It's self-interested people contesting for power in a world that is increasingly relevant only to themselves. But when Americans do like politics, I think they see it as a game, and I think they attach more importance to who's up and who's down than to the broader issues.
What about the way it reflects people's interests, desires, and needs, what we would call real culture? Does it reflect culture at all?
American politics reflects the extraordinary diversity of the United States, and American politics reflects the separation of powers, the division of labor, federalism. It encourages diversity and produces wildly different kinds of politics all over the country. And unless you've traveled around and listened to politicians in different parts of the country, you'll never have any sense of what an exciting place it is. And people who are bored by politics today are really, I think, bored by the televised picture of politics in which the camera stuck in somebody's nose, the way this camera is stuck in my nose, are convincing people that all politicians are simply interested in the camera. And since everyone talks to the camera more or less the same way, they don't understand how differently they really talk to each other.
Well, that's part of the premise of this whole series. I mean, so what would you say to somebody that said to understand American politics, you have to go to Washington?
I think it's a great mistake to go to Washington because Washington has the biggest concentration of television cameras, so everybody talks the same. In the old days, when I was first watching politics 40 years ago, Southern politics and regional politics were much more evident if you saw film clips or news clips of people practicing politics in Washington. Their accents were more different. Their cultural mannerisms were more different. Their mode of dress was more different. I mean, Theodore Bilbo from Mississippi dressed differently than Mississippi politicians do today. And the reason the diversity is gone from Washington is because of the camera. And because the camera is designed to convey to the American people that we are one culture with one interest and one perspective. And of course we're not.
So, I mean, but
Let's just hold on the siren for a second.
okay.
I don't understand.
I'm sorry, we're just
politics.
getting rolling. I think we're clear on the siren. That's great.
Okay.
Are you okay now?
Yes.
I think you have to travel around the country if you're seriously interested in politics in order to understand the extraordinary diversity and variety of American politics. If you focus on politics in Washington, D.C., you focus on politics seen through the lens of a television camera. And increasingly, if you focus on even state politics in the larger states, you're seeing politics through the lens of the TV camera. But the TV camera is devoted to the proposition that we are one people, one race, one culture, with one eye. And they want to show politics as a contest among people, all of whom speak the same language, wear the same clothes, and are concerned about the same issues. But we're not all that way. So if you want to see politics the way it's really practiced, you have to travel around the country and look in a lot of back rooms and see how people really talk to each other when the camera's not on.
So how do they...
Sorry, you put your hand in the shot.
I did?
Yeah.
Oh.
We had a door slam as well. So.
Oh, the door slam was okay. Yeah. When did the hand come
When
in?
you reached up and, so, I don't know.
Okay.
Let's just try that one more time.
Sorry. Can we do that one more time? I will not put my hand in the shot.
I'm not sure I can do this one more time.
That's okay. Why should we go to the local places to watch politics?
Well, if you look in the local places, you see people relaxed. The camera's not in their eyes. And they wear the clothes of local people, and they talk in the local dialect. There are a lot of politicians who have a back-home accent, and they have a Washington accent. Al Gore can talk country in Tennessee, but he talks national televised politics when he's in Washington, D.C. And I think that's true of lots of politicians of both parties, so that If you want to see politics the way it comes across to those Americans who are interested in politics and go to the picnics and the barbecues and the condominium meetings to participate, you have to watch them interact at that scene. We almost never have a chance to do that. And if a television camera goes to watch them, unless it's done by a very sophisticated person, the camera forces them to go back into the national style.
What do people expect from politicians? What do they expect to get?
I think it's very difficult to say what people expect out of politics, and I'm not sure that there is any agreed upon sense of what they expect. Some people are passionate about issues and they care about abortion or school prayer or gun control, but most people aren't passionate about any one of those issues. What they're really passionate about, if anything, is that the politicians of the country represent the aspirations of the country, that when people look to politics, they want to see the promise of the American Constitution fulfilled. If you think about extremist movements today, they're very different from extremist movements we once had. We once had extremist movements that were overtly anti-Semite, or overtly anti-black, or overtly pro some cause. Today they keep talking about returning to the constitutional system. And though that's an extreme version, it's extreme only with respect to a broader understanding that politics for most Americans ought to be about fulfilling the American ambition. And when they see politicians apparently playing games, they become disappointed. And hence the great dissent in the amount of public confidence people have in politics as they see it. A dissent, I think, which is linked very much to the presence of the television camera.
Well, there's a dichotomy here which is hard to understand. For me especially, because, I mean, to be honest, you know, in doing this for the last 3 years, or actually doing this kind of stuff for all my life, you know, most people, when you say politician or people that work in politics, they think of somebody who's not honest. It's not an honest profession.
That's right.
But when I go to these places, I mean, there are no people that I've ever met who are more passionate about what they do than people that are in politics. So where's the disconnect over here? You have these people that really believe in what they do. I mean, they're not all idealistic, but they're, I mean, maybe musicians are more enthusiastic about what they do.
We're going to do something about that.
What just happened? Be quite frank, I mean, talking to people around the country, liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, people that are in politics are really enthusiastic. They're passionate most times about what they do. Where's the disconnect here? What's going on?
I think politicians have changed in a way that Americans don't fully appreciate. 30 or 40 years ago, in the old days of the United States Senate or the United States House of Representatives, people did not care as deeply about as wide a range of issues. Politics was more regional, more ethnic, more local. You followed party leadership for the good of the party. Today, politicians are drawn into an occupation that has lower social standing than it once did because, in part, they believe in something. Politics at the national level has become more ideological. If you listen to the House of Representatives or the Senate, you cannot doubt for a moment that most of the people who talk most of the time care very deeply about what they're talking about. This is something that is skipped past the American public, or perhaps another way of looking at it, American public bemoans gridlock precisely because politicians do believe so much in what they advocate that they're unwilling to compromise, and the result is gridlock. I think Americans still see politics in this aspirational sense, realize the American dream, convey our local aspirations onto the national stage, make the country go forward in some highly generalized way. But I think what they fail to notice is that the local connection between politicians and their constituents has been in part replaced by an ideological orientation to a set of beliefs, which is increasingly today one of the few things that will draw people into politics.
Well, why is that?
Well, the old sources of political power in the country, the capacity of the party to control nominations or control elections, the ability of easy campaign money to flow from party leaders, the traditional strength of some older congressional leaders, those have evaporated. And as a consequence, people have been brought in for other reasons, their own personal ambition linked in many cases to an ideological commitment. The other reason is that interest groups in this country have become nationalized. Interest groups are no longer primarily oriented around local issues. Interest groups are organized around affecting politics in Washington. And they are often the sources of support and leadership and influence for candidates, so that the focus of the country and the interest groups that support that focus is on Washington. And Washington has this huge agenda that it never had before. And when people want to participate in Washington politics, they want to be part of that agenda. But when they are part of that agenda, they enter it on the terms it sets for them. Namely, you have to believe in something. You have to be a liberal or a conservative. You have to be a freshman Republican or a liberal Democrat. And if you're that, you're rarely anything else.
Well, that's, I mean, and Steve, by the way, I did notice the cloud stuff, and don't the non-Washington based, non-congressional elections.
Mm-hmm.
So let me know when you've got speed.
Yeah, speed.
So, I mean, how important are issues in most American elections?
I don't think for the average voter, issues generally are that important. I think the average voter voting in an election, the average voter will tend to vote either Democratic or Republican depending on their party affiliation. And affiliation they don't re-examine very often. There's been a great rise in independents, but if you break it apart, you discover that a lot of the independents are really Republicans and a lot of the independents are really Democrats, and nothing much has changed except they like the title independents because it means they are, quote, thinking for themselves, unquote. And they tend to return incumbents, except when the economy turns bad or there is a crisis or a scandal. And when they deride politicians generally, they often don't deride the politician that they know. They deride all other politicians that they don't know. So to the extent that's true, issues are not going to drive the American public. But the activists in politics have become much more ideological than once was the case. The people who will send off contributions and join movements and listen to talk radio and write letters and join campaigns to descend on the Capitol or their state capital. These people are more ideological than in the past because politics no longer simply mobilizes local sentiments. There is this growing group of people who are mobilized by nationalized issues supported by nationalized interest groups.
So what's the matter with the American people? I mean, it seems like in other countries people care about issues and they don't seem to be that big a deal to the average American.
Well, I think the rest of the world is becoming more like the United States.
Can you start that over with the rest of the...
Just get a whole cloud here.
Are you all right?
Go on.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the rest of the country, the rest of the industrialized world at least, is becoming more like the United States. There is a growing distrust of politicians. There is an unease about what they see as national gridlock. There is a breaking up of the old class loyalties that once used to define votes exclusively. They're never going to become quite like the United States because we have a unique constitutional system that no other nation has. But I think the difference between the United States and England or the United States and France with respect to politics is less today than it once was. In the old days, abroad, people voted class interests defined by party labels to achieve class-related goals. They don't do that so much anymore. Whereas in the United States, we are drifting in the direction of acquiring a kind of class loyalty. It's a class defined less by money than by what you believe in. And the passions that are attached to what you believe in, I think, are becoming more important in American politics at the margin.
Why are some people Republicans and some people Democrats?
I think people are Republicans or Democrats in large measure because their parents were Republicans or Democrats. Now, if you ask people, they won't say that. But if you press them, they will admit it. What is passed on about politics across the family dinner table is not a set of ideologies so much, except for hardcore Democrats and hardcore Republicans. What it is passed on is a party label, to which the younger generation then adds its own meaning, picking that meaning up from the culture in which they live. But the party label persists, and even though people increasingly describe themselves as independents, they almost never switch to a party opposite that of their parents.
A lot of people, when you talk to them, will talk about voting for somebody because they like that person. They like the man or the woman. Can you describe what that process is? I mean, the way people tend to internalize?
I don't have any idea what people mean when they say they vote for the man or the woman. It could mean simply that they react to their sense of honesty or dishonesty, or they appreciate the way they approach issues, or they like their personal style, or they got a warm handshake from them when they met them at the condominium caucus. But it may mean something more than that. I don't think anybody's really ever explored what that phrase means. I don't think it's an irrelevant phrase. I think Americans really mean something serious by this, but they don't quite explain what it is. It's some combination, my guess is, of honesty, approachability, friendliness, and a general sense that the person intends, however imperfectly, the public good. And all of these things go into the vague definition that I like that person.
Let's talk about the candidates then. Why does anybody run for office?
I don't think there's a simple answer to why anybody runs for office, but there are a few common characteristics. If you run for office, you have to have immense self-confidence. The same kind of self-confidence that will take you up a corporate ladder. You have to believe in what you think. In my experience with politicians is that almost all of them believe very much in their own judgment and believe that if other people shared their judgment, the world would be a better place. I think other people in addition run for office because they value public attention. And this is different from the corporate world, where many high-ranking CEOs do not have a public audience. Politicians have an audience, and the really gifted politicians are ones that automatically embrace that audience. You bring in people into a room and they light up. You bring people into my room and my face turns dark because it's interrupting something more important I want to do. But politicians are different from me. And that sense of confidence, that liking for public attention, and other accidental features, particularly opportunity. There's a vacancy. I ought to run, nobody else any good is going to run, I think creates a kind of political motivation.
Do you think most people have any idea of what it's like to be a candidate in this country? What kind of consequences there are in people's lives?
I think people generally understand that it is difficult, but I don't think anyone really realizes how difficult it is to be a candidate for the first time and understand how much time you have to spend raising money, how much time you have to fight to get on television or on radio to get a 10-second soundbite across, how many interests will approach you, how many people will come up and lie to you in order to win favor in your campaign or in your staff office. This is an extremely distracting profession. It's become much more distracting during the several decades I've been watching politics. You can't run Washington anymore on a Tuesday to Thursday basis. It's a Sunday night to Saturday morning basis. And the demands on your time, the little time you have to read anything or think coherently about something, has simply multiplied dramatically.
We were talking about what people expect from politicians. You know, we're here close to Cambridge, where Tip O'Neill said all politics was local, and the localism had something to do with the way you related to your constituents. What can politicians do for people? I mean, I was reading an article talking about how constituent service in the past has now become influence peddling of today. Mm-hmm. I mean, what could politicians on the other side of the equation actually give to people?
I think politicians give to people a place where they can be heard about their complaints and a place where they can get some of these complaints addressed. And the best evidence of this is that the enormous growth we've experienced in congressional staffs has been largely devoted to staffing field offices in their constituencies' districts, so that the growth in staff has not so much proliferated in Washington as it's proliferated in the country. And these staff people are the eyes and ears of the politicians, designed to provide a place where people can go. Sometimes they're cranky people who go whether they have an argument or not. Other times they're people with real needs. And it's hard to know what politicians can do, but they can help people find their way through the political system. Sometimes by giving them influence, otherwise by just explaining to them how the system works. If things happen to the constituent that are good, the constituent is grateful to the politician even if the politician had nothing to do with the fact that the result was good. And if the result is bad, the politician can shrug his shoulders and say, that's the way the system works. This is what we're up against. Re-elect me and I will try to change the system. But I think that politics remains to some degree, as Tip O'Neill said, local. But it's less local today than it was when Tip O'Neill ran. It is much more nationalized. Districts vary. Tip O'Neill's district in Cambridge may retain its local orientation, as does Dan Rostenkowski's old district in Chicago. But if you go to many districts, you discover that politics, to the extent it engages people because they care about what's happening in Washington.
I ask that we move forward a couple of inches on that chair over there.
So you want Jim's chair
yes,
closer?
If you could.
Can you move it just a couple of inches closer? How are we doing on time with this the tape?
Fine.
Okay.
10 minutes
This
to
is
go.
very good. And actually what I'm doing is trying...
Occupation, there's nothing left untouched. unchanged. Okay.
Well, I actually want to talk about this whole idea of trying to get people's attention. I mean, one of the things that I'm actually cutting at night right now is the whole idea of the suburbanization, or what people derisively call the Californianization of American politics, where people are out in the suburbs of Atlanta or the suburbs of New Orleans or the suburbs of New York or what I imagine California, trying to find voters, if they're indeed trying to find them at all. I mean, what are the consequences of the fact that a majority of Americans now live in the suburbs to the actual practice of electoral politics?
I think that the movement of the American people to the suburbs has dramatically changed politics by breaking up old ethnic neighborhoods and replacing them with a more homogeneous, less diverse, certainly less ethnically clear suburban organization, in which people do not find places to live around the church they belong to, but find places to live based on the kind of house they want to live in. And this changes politics. And it changes it in one way by making politics much more national. Suburbs everywhere are pretty much the same, whereas the Boston North End and Greenwich Village in New York City and some of the older districts in San Francisco still retain a certain identity. Suburbs become common, defined largely simply by the income and preferences of the people who live there. So how do people approach an electorate that all lives in suburbs, and it increasingly acquires a more diffuse national orientation? Well, I think there's really only one way they can do that, and that is through television. And they can't have rallies in suburbs. You can't have a rally in a suburban shopping mall. Maybe some exist, but not very often. You can have a rally in Cadillac Square in Detroit. At least once you could. Maybe you can't anymore. So television has become the medium. Now, the difficulty with television is it only works for certain kind of candidates. Television isn't cost effective for most people running from the House of Representatives because your signal goes out across several districts. You're paying for the range of the signals, but you only care about the people getting the signal in your own district. So if it's not cost effective for many House representatives to use television, what in the world can they do? And I think the answer to that question is find all of the interest groups which involve people living in the suburbs and approach these people through their interest groups. The interest groups in American politics have become the AAA farm clubs of American politics. It's the way by which politicians reach into the suburbs, and it's a way by which some suburbanites, those who care about politics, reach into the national system. But this is very different from the territorial politics of big city America.
What does that mean in the future, the sort of things that I read?
Read a biography of Huey Long or Earl Long.
Well, I was thinking about actually the Willie Stark figure in Robert Penn Warren's book.
Yeah.
All the King's Men. God, I think my brain is beginning to go. You know, this is all the color of politics. This is all, the naked power, the colorful personalities. Is the suburbanization of America going to lead to a politics where there's nothing of interest anymore?
I think the suburbanization of the country and its increased focus on nationalized issues that are mediated by nationalized interest groups will undercut the diversity and the excitement and the color and flavor of American politics. You're not going to have Huey Long standing in front of a big crowd or Harry Truman standing in front of a big crowd, working them up with impassioned speeches. You're going to have a politics that is more retail, more focused, more ideologically driven. But the old style won't disappear. This is a big country, and big cities still exist, and they still practice an old style of politics. And there are suburbs where an old style of politics can be practiced, depending on the party loyalties in the area. But we're going to have less of the old style of politics. We're going to have a politics that is driven increasingly by television cameras.
Let's go to a place where television hasn't totally ruined politics, which is Chicago. Okay, one of the amazing things for us in Chicago still, when you were there, at a wonderful time when Bill Dawson's whole Southside organization still existed, and we actually talked to a whole lot of people there. We're not going to use that as part of our thing, but it's just we're mostly doing contemporary politics. But in Chicago politics, you talk to the guys down there, and everything is so naked, so direct. There are no niceties. There are no pieties. If people are talking about racial politics, they're not putting them in nice terms.
No.
If they're going to go, try to beat their opponent, then they're going to rip their signs down, and they'll let us go and film it. What is going on in a place like Chicago? How does this sort of thing happen?
Chicago, Illinois, which I started studying in the mid-1950s, and which is still in many ways my favorite city, and certainly my favorite political city, practices unvarnished American politics. They tear down signs, they put up their own signs over the other person's signs. They call each other by very unflattering ethnic names, and this goes for whites and blacks and whites. They use ethnic labels. My son was born in a Chicago hospital, and my wife was recovering in the room. The woman in the bed next to her leaned over and said, "Hi, I'm Martha. What are you?" Not "who are you?" "What are you?" And my wife said, "Well, I just gave birth." She says, "I know that, but what are you? Irish, Lithuanian, Welsh?" My wife had never been asked that question before because she grew up in the Midwest and the Far West. Chicago is a unique place, and what makes it unique? Why is it less duplicitous than New York City? I think it's a much better city than New York City because people are so honest. I think it's simply a collection of traditions that have been preserved by a political apparatus and by a highly intense ethnic-based neighborhood organization that has been, in effect, less challenged by the forces of political reform in this country than they've been challenged anywhere else. But when Chicago goes, and someday it will go, then it's gone forever because it can't exist anywhere else.
So Chicago is governed, or Chicago's politics are governed by ethnic blocs?
Chicago's politics are not simply governed by ethnic blocs. People vote for or against mayors depending whether they clean up the snow after a large storm. And they vote for or against people on a large variety of matters. But you've got to remember, as you know, Chicago has 50 aldermen, and each alderman's district is minuscule compared to the size of a Los Angeles City Council's district or the Board of Supervisors of Los Angeles County. Each one of those districts is the size of 2 congressional districts. So politics is local in Chicago because there are so many politicians who have to be elected from such small spaces that you can carry on essentially private conversations with your people in a way you cannot carry on private conversations in Los Angeles.
When we went to Chicago, one of the stories we wanted to cover was this whole idea of Harold Washington's coalition. And it's sort of going to that wonderful 1980s concept of the Rainbow Coalition. The Rainbow Coalition will have blacks, they'll have Latinos, they'll have people of color, and this is complete and utter non-reality in Chicago politics. And Richie Daley has made an alliance with Latinos. Everybody's very happy. It works very well. It'll probably last for a long time. What's with this whole idea of Rainbow Coalition in politics? Is it just the liberals or the media doesn't have a clue about how politics actually works?
I think the Rainbow Coalition concept is a farce that has been perpetrated by people who are trying to advance their own political interests by claiming wrongly that people of color all have something in common. Now, I happen to live in a city, Los Angeles, where people of color, using that term very broadly, have very little in common. The Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Mexicans, the El Salvadorans, and the blacks do not speak the same language. They do not join in similar organizations. They may vote for the same candidate, as they did vote for Tom Bradley when he ran for mayor. But they didn't do that because they're part of any coalition. Each group saw something special in it for them. The notion that there is a white majority against which people of color can organize is really a mischievous notion. First of all, there isn't a white majority. There are many separate white majorities. And secondly, there isn't a rainbow coalition of its opponents.
So is it any surprise to you in Chicago that Latinos have so easily allied with Mayor Daley?
I find nothing surprising about the fact that Latinos may ally themselves with Mayor Daley in Chicago, or that many of them may ally themselves with Mayor Richard, who's a Republican in Los Angeles. Latino politics is very diverse, but Latino politics is also more patron-driven. That is to say, they will follow leaders. They are interested in what can happen. Leadership position, if it's honestly won, is an important relationship which people do not discard lightly. It's very different from the politics in many other countries, and it may become different in the Latino communities in the future.
Tape change?
Tape change? Good.
Right on the surface. You don't have to dig very hard. People come up to you and tell you how it is. If you study politics in New York, and you're studying literally duplicity. People thought was like Chicago. I remember Kevin White saying he wanted to become like Richard Daley.
Mm-hmm.
There was no chance of that. But Boston politics was brutal and ethnic and candid and lurid for a long time. But that's changing. When Charlie Flaherty has to resign as Speaker of the House because 13 years ago the feds found out that he fudged his income tax return, something has happened in Boston.
Okay, ready.
You know, just riffing off of some of the stuff on Chicago, you're talking about Latinos and leadership. Do candidates for office in this country lead, or do they follow? I mean, is there any such real thing as leadership in electoral politics?
Well, I think there's all kinds of leadership in electoral politics. I think that politicians will define issues that people will respond to. Now, it's a tricky course to navigate. Politicians cannot define issues that people know about from their own first-hand experience. If the prices are going up at the supermarket or you're getting laid off at the aircraft factory, you know this. And politicians cannot define that away or change the scope of things. But they can define environmental politics, they can define foreign policy, they can define military policy, they can define a whole range of things that the average person does not have direct and personal access to. And I think politicians do that, and I think because of politics, the agenda of national affairs has changed. Politicians and their interest groups put environmentalism and similar matters on the agenda in a way that met with the approval of the voters. I'm not denying that, but the voters didn't put these issues on the agenda.
But isn't that somebody shooting something in the middle of literally nowhere?
Okay.
Noisy country. I hadn't noticed that, but you're right.
The sort of stuff you're talking about, though, some people would say that's the exception. That leadership or those sorts of issues are the exception.
Leadership by politicians, by definition, is exceptional because politicians have first and foremost a desire to satisfy their constituents, and that means first and foremost figuring out what the constituents care about. And many constituents care about enough things so politicians ordinarily don't have to lead. They simply have to say, elect me and I will advance your agenda further than the other fellow will. But sometimes they lead, and they lead when they are driven by nationalized interest groups and the nationalized media to put some agenda high on the list. Now, it's not easily done. You have to put an agenda, new agenda item on the list in a way that has some salience and responsiveness. I remember automobile safety came to this country in part because the editor of the editorial page of the New York Times had lost a daughter in a traffic accident, and the New York Times began running a dramatic series of editorials about traffic safety, even though the safety of automobiles was at the time dramatically improving. By the time somebody in Congress decided to take Ralph Nader seriously, they didn't take Ralph Nader seriously because he was making an economic or engineering argument. They took him seriously because first, he was giving support for a position the New York Times had taken, and secondly, because General Motors had investigated him, and as a consequence, the attack on the automobile industry could begin with an attack on General Motors for having attempted to do something scurrilous with Ralph Nader. So that this coincidence between an agenda being driven by a nationalized interest group and the ability to compete for the attention of constituents concerned about scandal work very nicely together, and subsequent issues have often followed the same pattern.
So over time, you know, these are specific issues. Are there, since all politicians want to win or to be reelected, to exist in the American political system, are there common appeals or common types of candidate appeals that work?
I think what constitutes a candidate appeal that works generically will vary by time. Right now, as we speak, the idea of devolution and the idea of returning more of government to state government is an idea that has some appeal. I'm not sure it's a dramatic appeal, but most people respond affirmatively to it. That's a new development. When Dwight Eisenhower was president, he tried mightily to return power to the states and made absolutely no progress. And subsequent presidents, Richard Nixon, for example, tried also, and they made absolutely no progress. Today, that idea has taken hold. Why has it taken hold? It's hard to say. One reason is that there are an increasing number of governors who have attracted a degree of popular support by taking bold positions, doing dramatic things in Michigan or California or Wisconsin or Ohio. Another thing is the general dissatisfaction that people have with the pace of change in the national government. So perhaps devolution is the fallout from the rise of strong governors and the apparent weakening of the federal government. But in 5 years, it will be another issue. It won't be devolution, it will be something else. And if I could guess what it would be, I would become very wealthy.
What about the whole idea of change? Why is change always, seemingly always, so appealing to the American electorate?
I think it's because the American electorate disagrees about how the country ought to be run. And since they disagree, there is a demand for change. The difficulty is the change person A wants is different from the change person B wants. Person A wants lower taxes and devolution and the reinstatement of school prayer, and person B wants the opposite of these things. The American political system has to take into account these rival views, and by trying to take them into account, reaches a kind of uncomfortable middle position that leaves both sides desirous of change. In fact, the American political system changes dramatically. When you think, start again. If you think about American politics in the 1950s, there was not on the agenda civil rights, crime, drug abuse, juvenile delinquency, single-parent homes, school prayer. None of these issues were there. Today, all of these issues were there. And in between times, there have been dramatic changes in how we've operated. For a long time, the tax rates went up and up. Then suddenly, the tax rates went down and down. For a while, industries were subject to increasing government regulation. Now we are deregulating industry. I think the American political system is, in the long run, more open to change than most. Indeed, the policies of change that have occurred in Europe with respect to taxes and deregulation are designed to follow the American pattern. So our system does change, but Americans, seeing only our system and not other systems, don't think it changes enough.
Well, talking about some of the bigger change, at least the media covers, what impact do new groups, when I say new, people, the groups that are new politically, Latinos, gays, Christians, people that are apparently new in politics, or they're pressed that way, what impact do they have on the political process? Do they change the process? Does the process change them? Do they have any impact at all?
I think new groups have an impact on the political process. It depends on what group you're talking about. Latinos have had less of an impact because they vote less, they participate less, they're less aggressive in asserting their political agenda, except in a few cities. The Christian Coalition and organized homosexuals have had a much greater influence because they're more aggressive, more organized.
Hold on one second.
Sorry.
Bring it up and tell you to sit into that frame here. Okay, speak.
Okay, sorry.
The Christian Coalition, organized homosexuals have a greater impact in politics when they enter because they all come from backgrounds in which they are experienced in politics, experienced in organization, and have few of the inhibitions of newer ethnic groups who are trying very tentatively to put a toe into American politics and work their way in very gradually, so that they can have a dramatic effect by changing not the direction of politics generically, but changing how primary elections are held, by influencing the kinds of appeals individuals must make when they're trying to win their party's nomination. If there are 5 candidates for office, you could, in principle, win the nomination by getting 21% of the vote, and if it's a lopsided district in partisan terms, you win the election by getting 21% of the primary vote. Well, and in that environment, whether it's conservative Christian Coalition members or liberal gays and lesbians, you can have a dramatic effect by giving some politicians an opportunity to seize a new group, identify with its cause, and hope to add enough other people so you get to, let's say, 21%. So their capacity to change politics must not be underestimated. Ethnic groups entering politics are very different because ethnic groups tend to come from backgrounds in which their opportunity to participate in politics was so limited that it's one of the reasons they came to this country. And when they come here, they don't rush into politics. Asians haven't rushed in, Latinos haven't rushed in. They represent a culture that assigns a very different role to organization and to community interests. They come from cultures in which there is literally no national interest. There's a village interest, a family interest, a patron interest. And entering American politics requires a generation or more of new political learning.
I was thinking when you were talking about, about the last answer before this, about all the issues that were not on the agenda in the 1950s and the issues that are now part of the agenda. Isn't that just one of the ways that American politics reflects the culture in the larger society?
I think the growth in the agenda of American politics reflects 2 things. First of all, it reflects the growing expectation that Americans have that the national government will tend to a wide range of their concerns. But secondly, it also reflects decisions by the government that it would no longer be abstemious about taking up these challenges. The decisions by the Supreme Court and the decisions by Congress have in effect modified the Constitution. When the Mann Act was being debated in 1910, that's the law that bans white slavery, there was a deep split in Congress as to whether the federal government had any right at all to play any role in law enforcement, and it was only narrowly carried. Today, if there is an upsurge in crime, the voters expect the politicians will play a large role in it, and all of the inhibitions that had once operated on politicians to prevent them from playing a role in crime control have disappeared. Their only problem now is to think of what to do, and that's a very difficult matter because there's not, in fact, much the federal government can do about this question.
You know, it's sort of like looking at all the politicians talking about crime over years and years and years and years. Why should historically underrepresented people place their faith in electoral politics in this country?
Explain what you mean.
Well, people that think they're underrepresented. I mean, African Americans, I suppose, are one group, but being, you know, I mean, I talk to a lot of Christians, and they say the system is biased against them. I mean, I'm talking about people that think that the government either is not responsive, their interests are not being represented enough. I mean, it's a strain of American, at least American society, thinking that the government is not responsive.
I think most people, if they brood about it seriously, will realize the government is not responsive to their interests. It's certainly not responsive to my interests, and the reason is this is a big country with a lot of people, and my interests simply cannot dominate the interests of other people. Those who attempt to become active in politics magnify their role in society. They gain additional stature and power, but at the same time they think they're losing. The Christian Coalition or organized gays may think they're losing, but they've had a profound effect on American politics. They don't realize it because in a country this size, dramatic change in their direction is not possible. There are too many people who disagree with them. But the fact that other people now must debate the issues they have raised is a dramatic measure of how important their role has been.
What about the whole idea of winners and losers?
There's a pop on it.
Yeah, don't worry about it. What about the whole idea of winners and losers in American elections? I mean, the media tends to, you were talking about the sports analogy right at the top of the interview. And we have people that win, we have people that lose, and losers tend to disappear. It's as if, you know, if you're a loser in an American election, you don't count anymore. Is there a place for losers in American elections? Do they play any roles at all?
I don't think there's generally a place for losers in American elections because politics in the United States, though it offers untold opportunities to seek elective office, we probably have 500,000 offices that are up for election in any given cycle in this country, also has no place where losers can fit in. We don't have a House of Lords to which they can be promoted and live in rustication. We don't have a party apparatus in which they can find a place and run again the next time their turn comes. Politics is individualized to the point that each candidate must seize the vital opportunity when the opportunity presents itself. And if they win, they're in office. If they lose, then they're not in office. They can try to wait for another opportunity, but if they do wait for another opportunity, they're called a two-time loser. And that's a great penalty to have to pay. Some people who have lost once or twice do make a comeback, but they're a rarity. So politics is so individualized and so opportunistic that it's a real gamble, which is why one of the reasons political campaigns are so intense. They know that if you lose, it is all over.
The light is, no, it's a cloud over here. That was good. In thinking about that and talking about the risks that are involved in this sort of thing, let's go back to the political personality. What kind of a person bases their entire, you know, their ego existence on something which you either win 100% or you lose 100%?
People who are willing to make a full-time, long-term commitment to political ambition are people who first have a great deal of self-confidence, secondly, value public esteem very greatly, and thirdly, are riverboat gamblers. They're willing to mortgage the house, take the money, spend it on politics, in the very real possibility that they will never get it back. And even winners sometimes have difficulty retiring old campaign debts. Losers have much greater difficulty. So it takes an extraordinary person. extraordinary in a good sense and extraordinary in a bad sense to run for politics. One of the reasons some people don't like politicians is that they don't like the personality type that is attracted to that role. Now, we don't have to have that personality type. We could abandon the Constitution. We could adopt a parliamentary system of government. We could have party leaders pick old friends and supporters and individuals to run for office and guarantee them pretty much a free ride. We would have a system in which the people in office were more like us. But we would also have a system in which us would have much less access to politics.
So because the cloud went over, can we have one more statement about American politics in terms of winners and losers?
You mean you want me to repeat the whole thing?
No, not that. What you just said was fine. And actually just leading back to this whole idea of, of winners and losers in American politics.
Being a loser in American politics is a serious matter because American politics is driven by individual ambition, largely unsupported by parties, that must seize rare and infrequent opportunities to score. And if you fail, then there is no place for you to go. There's no party to provide you with a home, no House of Lords to which you can be promoted, no party position that you can take. And as a result, if you lose, you're out of politics. And if you attempt to come back, you come back with a label on you that you're a one-time loser or a two-time loser, and that counts against you.
Now, something that, again, I thought about when I was in graduate school, and I know you've written about, at least to a certain extent, is the permanent government. The relationship between the bureaucracy, between staffs, between interest groups. When all is said and done, how much impact do elections actually have on the real workings of day-to-day government?
I don't think elections have a dramatic impact on the workings of day-to-day government because the workings of day-to-day government are largely driven by long-term statutory relationships governing how your taxes are collected, how the mail is delivered, whether you're going to be drafted in the military and the like. But elections do have a dramatic effect when the election approaches what political scientists like to call a critical or realigning election. Now, there's a lot of debate about what this means, but there's no doubt about the fact that some elections make a big difference because they convey a new mood. The 1994 election conveyed a new mood. The 1974 election conveyed a new mood. The 1964 election conveyed a new mood. And when you look at it in a long time perspective, you can see how dramatic the change is. Between 1964, when Barry Goldwater ran for the presidency, and today, the South has changed from being a totally Democratic region to a totally Republican region with no likelihood in the near future that it will ever be anything else. Now that is an enormous change, and it was brought about by electoral competition.
So there are all sorts of professions that you could have chosen. Why did you choose to study politics?
Because I liked my poli-sci professor.
Start by talking about politics and the attraction of politics.
Well, I began interested in the study of politics because my undergraduate teacher, who was my favorite teacher, was a political science teacher, and I decided I wanted to be like that person. And so when I graduated from college, I looked for opportunities to go to graduate school. And the study of politics is a good thing for me because I really can't imagine anything else I could do.
And nothing else inherent in politics in terms of what, I was talking about what politics fulfilled in other people. What does it fulfill for you?
To me, politics is interesting because it's an intellectual puzzle. It's not interesting to me because it has any intuitive appeal, because I like politics or want to be in politics or want to hold a position, close association with politicians. It's simply an intellectual puzzle. It's about how this country is governed and whether it is governed well or poorly, and how the political process affects whether it's governed well or poorly. And answering those questions I find to be very important and intellectually satisfying.
So in pondering politics and writing about it or writing about policies, have you ever imagined yourself running for office?
I've never conceived for an instant of playing any role in politics whatsoever.
Never crossed your mind or never thought about what it would be like?
Never crossed my mind, and I've certainly never thought about what it would be like.
Have you ever had friends that have run for office?
I have had very close friends who have run for office, and one in particular has been extremely successful. And we are good friends. But the person with whom I'm a good friend, who's also very successful in politics, is also something of an intellectual, so that we can talk about politics from an intellectual perspective, even though I know that he has great gifts as a practical politician. And that connection is very pleasing to watch, but it's not simply because he's successful in politics. It's because he's also a part-time professor.
So does that ever make you, again, not thinking about running for politics, does it ever put you in the position of thinking what it would be like if you were in his role?
No.
Okay. How are we doing with the tape?
We're fine. There's room, Tom?